In the summer of 1981, Sylvester Stallone disappeared into the woods of British Columbia with a knife, a sleeping bag, and instructions that he not be contacted for 3 weeks. The cast and crew of First Blood thought he was insane. The studio thought he was being unnecessarily difficult. His agent thought he was sabotaging a major opportunity. But Stallone knew something they didn't. He couldn't play John Rambo without becoming him first. What happened in those 3 weeks and during the brutal filming that followed became Hollywood legend. But the truth is darker and stranger than anyone realized. Stallone didn't just play a traumatized veteran. He systematically traumatized himself to understand the character. The method acting was real, the suffering was real, and the blood on Rambo's knife was very, very real. First Blood was supposed to be a straightforward action film. Based on David Murrell's 1972 novel, the project had been in development hell for years. Multiple studios passed. Multiple actors were considered: Steve McQueen, Robert De Niro, Clint Eastwood, Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman. All passed or were unavailable. By 1981, the project landed with producer Andrew Vina and director Ted Kotcheff, with Sylvester Stallone attached to star. Stallone was hot off Rocky and Rocky II, a proven box office draw, but studios were skeptical. Rambo was darker, more violent, more controversial than Rocky. It was about a Vietnam veteran suffering from PTSD, hunted by small-town cops, who unleashes violence learned in war. The script that Stallone received was rough. Rambo was barely a character, more of an action figure, killing people and blowing things up with no emotional depth. The studio wanted a simple revenge thriller. Wronged veteran kills bad guys, audience cheers. Stallone knew that wouldn't work. He'd learned from Rocky that audiences needed to care about the character, not just watch him fight. So he rewrote the script extensively, adding emotional depth, trauma, vulnerability. He transformed Rambo from an action figure into a human being. But writing the character wasn't enough. Stallone needed to understand him. That's when he decided to disappear into the wilderness. The survival training began in July 1981. Stallone hired a former Army Ranger as a consultant and told him, "I need to learn what Rambo knows. Survival, evasion, how to live in the wilderness with nothing." For 3 weeks, Stallone lived alone in the forests of British Columbia. He built shelters from branches and leaves. He purified water from streams. He set traps for small animals, and when he caught them, he killed them, skinned them, and ate them. He didn't bring food. He didn't bring a phone. He had a knife, basic camping equipment, and a radio for absolute emergencies only. The crew knew his general location, but were instructed not to contact him unless he called first. Stallone later said those 3 weeks were the most psychologically challenging experience of my life. The isolation was crushing. Days passed without hearing another human voice. The silence of the forest became oppressive. His mind played tricks, phantom sounds, imagined threats, paranoia. He understood, in a small way, what soldiers experienced in Vietnam: the constant state of alert, the inability to relax, the way isolation erodes sanity. He also learned practical skills: how to identify edible plants, how to build a fire without matches, how to stay warm in freezing nights, how to move quietly through dense forest, how to think like prey being hunted. But the psychological preparation went further than survival skills. Stallone brought with him extensive research on PTSD, interviews with Vietnam veterans, psychological studies, his own consultants' combat experiences. In the forest alone, he read these accounts repeatedly. He forced himself to imagine trauma: being captured, being tortured, watching friends die, returning home to a country that hated him. He practiced a technique he'd later describe as controlled dissociation, deliberately triggering anxiety responses, letting fear and rage build, then containing it just below explosion level. He wanted to access Rambo's emotional state, a man on the edge of breaking, barely holding himself together. Some nights, he'd wake up from nightmares and continue to stay in that heightened state rather than calming down. He'd sit in the darkness, heart racing, mind spiraling, experiencing genuine fear, and then he'd file away those sensations to access later during filming. It was dangerous. Not physically, though survival training had its risks, but psychologically. Deliberately traumatizing yourself, even in a controlled way, has consequences. You can't always turn it off. When Stallone emerged from the woods in early August, the crew said he looked different. Physically, he'd lost about 15 pounds. He was lean, almost gaunt, with sunburned skin and cuts on his hands and arms. But the real change was in his eyes, something haunted, something wild. "He scared me," director Ted Kotcheff later admitted. When he came back from that wilderness training, there was something feral about him. He wasn't the sly I'd met before production. He was someone else. Stallone moved differently, spoke differently. He was quieter, more watchful, constantly scanning his environment. The charm and humor he'd shown earlier had been replaced by intensity. He'd found Rambo. Now he had to channel it. Filming began in August 1981 in Hope, British Columbia. The production was brutal from day one. Most of First Blood takes place outdoors in harsh conditions: forests, mountains, caves, rivers. The weather was unpredictable: rain, cold, occasional snow, even in late summer. Stallone refused almost all creature comforts. When other actors went to their trailers between takes, Stallone stayed on location. When they wore warm jackets between scenes, Stallone stayed in Rambo's torn clothing. When they ate catered meals, Stallone ate minimally, maintaining the lean, hungry physicality. The director and crew thought he was being difficult. He wasn't. He was maintaining character, keeping himself in Rambo's mental state. And then the real method acting began. The knife, Rambo's iconic survival knife, became Stallone's tool for authenticity. In the film, Rambo uses the knife constantly, cutting branches, building traps, as a weapon. Stallone decided that to make these scenes believable, he needed to actually use the knife for real tasks, not just pretend. During the scene where Rambo builds a shelter in the woods, Stallone actually built the shelter. He cut branches with the knife, which was razor sharp, a real survival blade, not a prop. His hands weren't protected. He cut himself repeatedly, small nicks and slices on his palms and fingers. The crew offered to bandage the cuts. Stallone refused. "Rambo wouldn't stop for little cuts," he said. "Neither will I." The blood in those scenes, dripping from his hands as he works, was real, his blood. The famous scene where Rambo sews up his own wound. Also real. In the film, Rambo has a gash on his arm that he closes with a needle and thread. No anesthesia, just gritting his teeth through the pain. The script called for makeup effects, a fake wound, fake needle, Stallone miming the pain. Stallone said no. He wanted it real. The production brought in a medical supervisor. Stallone explained what he wanted. A real, cut-controlled, safe, but real, that he would actually suture on camera. The medical team refused. Way too dangerous, too much liability, explicitly against protocol. Stallone found a compromise. He would use the real knife to make small, shallow cuts on his arm, supervised by the medic, and then actually suture them. Not deep cuts that needed stitches, just surface cuts that could be sutured for the camera, and then properly treated afterward. The medical supervisor agreed reluctantly, documenting everything meticulously to protect the production from liability. The scene was shot in one take. Cameras rolled. Stallone took the knife, the real knife, the one he'd been using throughout filming, the one already stained with his blood from other scenes, and made 3 small cuts on his forearm. The pain was immediate and sharp. Blood welled up. Stallone's jaw clenched, genuine reaction, not acting. Then he threaded the needle and began suturing, pushing the needle through his skin, pulling the thread tight. His face contorted again, not acting. Real pain, real blood. Real suturing. The crew watched in horrified silence. Several people turned away. The cameraman kept filming. When Stallone finished, his arm shook slightly from adrenaline and pain. The medical supervisor immediately moved in to treat the wounds, properly disinfecting, bandaging, documenting for insurance purposes. Director Ted Kotcheff asked Stallone, "Why? Why do it for real?" "We could have faked it perfectly." Stallone's answer, "Because I needed to know what it felt like. Rambo doesn't fake his pain. Neither can I." The obsession with authenticity extended to the film's most brutal scenes. When Rambo falls through tree branches, Stallone actually fell hitting real branches, padded slightly for safety, but still painful. When Rambo is thrown against rocks, Stallone was actually thrown stunt padding underneath, but the impacts were real. The famous scene where Rambo jumps from a cliff into a tree, then falls into a river, Stallone did the full stunt himself. 60 feet from cliff to tree, another 20 feet from tree to water. Stunt coordinators were present, safety measures in place, but the jump was real. Performed by Stallone, not a stunt double. He injured his back on that stunt, compressed vertebrae, pain that would last for weeks. He kept filming. When Rambo was hunted through caves and tunnels, Stallone was actually crawling through real caves in British Columbia, tight spaces, cold water, genuine claustrophobia. He refused to use built sets. Rambo wouldn't be crawling through a set, he said. He'd be in real caves, terrified. So am I. During one cave scene, Stallone genuinely became stuck in a tight passage. His shoulders wedged between rocks. For about 90 seconds, he couldn't move forward or backward. Panic set in, real panic, genuine terror of being trapped underground. The crew had to help extract him. When he emerged, he was shaking, hyperventilating, experiencing genuine trauma response. They shut down filming for the day. Stallone returned the next morning and did the scene again, pushing through the claustrophobia, because that's what Rambo would do. The psychological toll mounted as filming progressed. Stallone was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, often waking from nightmares where he was actually Rambo, being hunted, being tortured, unable to escape. The line between character and actor was blurring. He lost more weight. He was eating minimally, maintaining Rambo's hunted, desperate physicality. The production doctor expressed concerns about malnutrition. Stallone waved them off. His relationships with the cast and crew became strained. He was difficult, moody, prone to sudden anger, channeling Rambo's PTSD responses. People started avoiding him between takes because conversations could turn tense unpredictably. His wife at the time, Sasha Chak, visited the set and was disturbed by what she saw. "You're not yourself," she told him. "You're scaring me." "I'm Rambo," Stallone replied. That's the point. The film's emotional climax, Rambo's breakdown, where he describes his friend dying in Vietnam, nearly didn't happen. In David Morrell's novel, Rambo dies at the end. In early script drafts, Rambo died at the end. But Stallone argued for a different ending. Rambo survives but breaks down completely, finally releasing the trauma he's been carrying. Stallone wrote the breakdown speech himself, Rambo describing how he can't hold a job, can't connect with people, can't forget watching his friend be blown apart. It's the emotional core of the entire film. The moment where Rambo stops being an action figure and becomes a tragic human being. Filming that scene was scheduled for the last week of production. By then, Stallone had spent 3 months maintaining Rambo's psychological state. He'd isolated himself, injured himself, starved himself, traumatized himself, all to access the character. When the cameras rolled on the breakdown scene, Stallone didn't have to act. All the accumulated stress, pain, isolation, and deliberately triggered trauma came pouring out. The tears were real. The emotional collapse was real. He was breaking down as Rambo, but he was also breaking down as Sylvester Stallone, releasing 3 months of psychological punishment. Richard Crenna, playing Colonel Troutman, held Stallone during the scene. Later, Crenna said, "That wasn't acting. Sly was genuinely falling apart. We had to shoot it in one take because I don't think he could have done it again." When First Blood wrapped in November 1981, Stallone couldn't immediately drop the character. The psychological state he'd cultivated for 3 months, hypervigilance, Paranoia, controlled rage, trauma responses didn't disappear just because filming ended. He'd trained his nervous system to operate in crisis mode. You can't just turn that off. For weeks after production, Stallone struggled with what psychologists call role residue, inability to fully separate from a character. He'd startle at sudden noises, he'd have trouble sleeping. He'd experience waves of anger or anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. He saw a therapist briefly, who told him he'd essentially given himself a mild form of PTSD through his method acting. Not real PTSD, he hadn't experienced actual combat trauma, but his brain had been trained into similar response patterns through deliberate psychological conditioning. It took about 3 months for Stallone to fully come back from Rambo. His wife said it was like watching someone return from war, even though he'd only been making a movie. First Blood opened in October 1982 to massive success. Critics praised Stallone's performance as surprisingly nuanced. Audiences connected with Rambo as more than an action hero. They saw a damaged human being. The film made $125 million worldwide and turned Rambo into a cultural icon. But almost nobody knew what Stallone had done to create that performance. The deliberate isolation, the survival training, the real cuts and real blood, the psychological self-harm, the trauma residue that lingered for months. In interviews, Stallone downplayed his method acting. He'd mentioned the survival training briefly, but skipped the darker details. He didn't talk about deliberately traumatizing himself because it sounded insane, and because part of him knew it was insane. Years later, in a 2008 interview promoting Rambo, the fourth film, Stallone was more honest. "I went too far with the method acting on First Blood. I damaged myself psychologically in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I thought I was being dedicated. Really, I was being reckless with my mental health." The interviewer asked if he regretted it. "No," Stallone said, "because it worked. Rambo is real because I made him real, even if it meant making myself hurt. But I'd never recommend that approach to other actors. There are safer ways to access emotion." The truth about Rambo's knife and the blood on it wasn't fully revealed until 2019. A crew member from First Blood published a behind-the-scenes book that included photos and stories from production. One photo showed Stallone's hands during filming covered in bandages and cuts from using the real knife. The crew member wrote, "We all thought Sly was crazy. He kept cutting himself with that knife, real cuts, real blood." The prop master tried to give him a dulled training knife. Sly refused. He said Rambo would use a sharp knife, so he'd use a sharp knife. By the end of filming, that knife had so much of Sly's blood on it that we considered keeping it as a medical biohazard. Fans were shocked. The iconic knife replicas of which had sold millions had been covered in Stallone's actual blood during filming. Stallone confirmed the story in a 2020 interview. "Yeah, that knife cut me dozens of times. Little cuts, mostly. A few deeper ones. I still have scars on my hands from First Blood. Every time I see them, I remember Rambo. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. Then I remember what we created, and I think it was worth it." The lasting impact of Stallone's method acting on First Blood is complicated. On one hand, it created one of the most authentic performances in action cinema. Rambo feels real because Stallone made him real through suffering. The character's trauma, pain, and rage aren't acted, they're channeled from genuine experiences. On the other hand, Stallone's approach set a dangerous precedent. Young actors sometimes cite his dedication as inspiration for their own extreme method acting, starving themselves, isolating themselves, deliberately triggering psychological distress. Stallone himself has warned against this. "I was young and stupid. I thought suffering for my art made me noble. Really, I was just damaging myself." You can create great performances without destroying yourself. Please don't use me as an example to follow. But the legend persists. Rambo's knife had real blood. The cuts were real. The suffering was real. And somewhere in that suffering, Sylvester Stallone found truth. Whether that truth was worth the cost is a question he's still asking himself 40 years later. The blood on Rambo's knife was Stallone's blood. The pain in Rambo's eyes was Stallone's pain. The trauma in Rambo's voice was Stallone's trauma, deliberately self-inflicted in service of a character. Method acting at its most extreme, dedication at its most dangerous, and authenticity purchased at a price most actors would never be willing to pay. Sylvester Stallone paid it. And John Rambo became immortal because of it.